Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about movements and initiatives that seek to move humanity to its next epochal iteration. This podcast is brought to you by Witlingo. When it comes to managing a community, one of the keys to success is the ability to effectively communicate with the members of that community. If you are a service coordinator or responsible for community engagement, Witlingo provides a multi-channel, multilingual notification and engagement platform to help you work more efficiently and effectively. For more information, please visit www.witlingo.com. That's www.witlingo.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid.
Matt Colquhoun, welcome to Humanity 8.0.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for making the time. Today is Friday, isn't it? Friday, June 14th?
Yes.
2024. Wow, 2024 already. I was going to say 2023. 2024. And we are in, I would say we are I think we are in special times, to be honest with you. These are special times. Well, we always say we're in special times, but these seem to be a crucial moment in history, at least recent history, with what's happening around the world, with Ukraine war, with this increasing rivalry between the United States and China, with what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, and just very interesting times, I think. But for today, as we were talking before, I'm very interested in Deleuze as a philosopher. I think he provides lots of conceptual tools to help make sense of the world, and I like mainly his approach of what can be done, what can we do, how can one live one's life, how can, as opposed to what is a good life and so forth. How can it be creative, right? And I think if there are times where creativity is probably a possibility, I think it's now, because we have such access to so much information, so many tools and so forth, that and so it just felt appropriate to speak with someone like yourself. So you are currently writing a dissertation in your PhD program on Deleuze, right? So maybe tell us a little bit about your context. I mean, you're doing many things. I found you. I was looking for someone, and I didn't want to have somebody who has been like writing books about it, and then they are stale, and they have they are established, and they have a certain perspective. I want somebody who's fresh. So I was deliberately looking for, and you are ideal. You're somebody who is, has been thinking deeply. But tell us about yourself, and you can talk about anything beyond simply what you're doing on Deleuze.
Sure. Well, yeah, and thank you. I mean, it's great to have the opportunity. So yeah, my name's Matt Colquhoun. I'm a writer I've been writing for a bit now, thinking, philosophizing, though it wasn't kind of my background. Started my adult life, at least, training to be a photographer, and working in the arts, and about 7-8 years ago, went to do a master's degree in contemporary art theory at Goldsmiths in London, and that kind of changed a lot of things for me. Started writing, and I guess I'm probably best known for writing about the work of Mark Fisher, who was sort of a leftist cultural critic here in the UK, who passed away in 2017. Whilst I was one of his students at Goldsmiths, and have basically been writing since that time on a few different problems, sort of starting with Mark's work and moving outwards, and I guess primarily between tensions felt between our sense of ourselves as individuals and understandings of community. And I guess I wrote my second book fairly recently. It came out in 2023, called Narcissus in Bloom, which is subtitled as an alternative history of the selfie, which is a bit of a misnomer. It's more of a sort of alternative history of the self, how we understand the self, particularly through art practices like photography. And yeah, that was a few years ago. And now I'm doing my PhD in philosophy at Newcastle, specifically looking at Deleuze and Guattari. And I guess particularly the tension between those two, individual community, self and other in their work as well, for Deleuze and Guattari. Primarily looking at politics of the family, which is very central, I think, to Deleuze's work and Guattari's as well, as sort of renegade psychoanalysts. But it's a kind of the focus on the family is kind of because it's a kernel for a lot of what they go on to talk about in other contexts. I think for me anyway, their thought, though it takes on many different forms and looks at many different topics, always comes back to understandings of difference, whether that's kind of epistemologically or socially or politically, and how we understand, I guess, the sort of boundaries we set up in life to distinguish one thing from another. And that's especially true in the family. Who is a member of your family and who is not? How does that make us approach people that we know and are related to or otherwise? But I guess in the context of what we're talking about today, their thought, I think, really does have a lot of implications for the situation in Israel and Gaza, especially right now, but Israel, Palestine in general. How this strange amalgam of I guess, one fairly recent nation state, another kind of almost geopolitical void, at least ideologically speaking, a stateless, displaced people, how those two things exist together and struggle for not just recognition, but I guess development and becoming. Becoming being a key concept for Deleuze.
Yeah, before we go there, I just want to delve a little bit more about your dissertation. And so the selfie there, is it used in the context of like taking pictures of yourself, or is it totally different? Is it?
Yeah. So that the selfie is kind of, I use it as a sort of I guess as an example that everyone will be familiar with in this day and age. And use that as a kind of, how do we understand the selfie? I guess as a kind of a form of self-expression, but as how we moralize against it. And what Deleuze is, well, not just Deleuze, but how 20th century philosophy in general kind of problematizes our moralizing about our own self-interest.
Well, give me an outline of, because I love that. Give me an outline of how how you're approaching it critically, right? Or demoralizing about it. Just give me a sense. Is it all about, because it is actually a really interesting phenomenon, recent, right? The concept of, because we didn't do that before, right? Concept, taking a picture of myself without negotiating with other folks who are with me, right? Before that, it's like I'm with someone, I had to be with someone, or I ask a stranger, right, to take a picture of me. But here it's at the spur of the moment. So what's new? Because Deleuze is all about newness, right? What's new that has been introduced here that is interesting? My gut feel says there is something really interesting going on here, and I'm glad to sort of you're approaching it, trying to just figure out what it reveals about us or whatever. But tell me, give me a sense of like how you're approaching it.
Well, that's definitely the core question of the book, is what is new about the selfie. And so the book kind of goes back into art history and looks not only at the selfie as a kind of postmodern phenomenon, but the self-portrait in general. And the very first self-portraits that we see, they kind of emerge around the Italian Renaissance, but they emerge alongside the concept of the individual. Like, we've not always had that concept,
right?
And so that kind of you see the I can't remember which comes first now, but like you have Rene Descartes' I think, therefore I am, most famously, I guess, a philosophy that positions the self as a first principle of philosophy. And it is around that same time, within 100 years or so, that we have the very first self-portraits, at least notable ones, by the likes of Albrecht Dürer, Rembrandt. So the argument in the book, where it starts anyway, is that the self-portrait was once very, very new. It was a whole new way of expressing this idea of ourselves as individuals that we didn't have before. How that collides with political understandings, I guess the birth of sort of classic liberalism that also places the self at its heart and the individual at the heart of its political position. And so, tracing out that history, then, okay, what's new about the selfie? And I think the argument that I take in the book is that even with the invention of photography specifically, photography kind of being renowned in so many sort of critical engagements with it as a medium, like Roland Barthes, Susan Sontag, you have this preoccupation with death rather than life. Photography, in being a kind of snapshot of a moment and coming to understand that we can represent life as we kind of see it, generally speaking, reminds us of our own finitude and our own mortality. And that becomes a real fixation for a lot of theorists on photography. I think the selfie is kind of like a mainstreaming of that discomfort. So the argument of the book is that the selfie isn't necessarily a symbol of our own self-obsession, of our own kind of narcissism, but rather, it's a kind of questioning. I think we take images of ourselves in general, because we kind of are sort of generally aware that this moment won't last. We're kind of aware of how difficult it is to grasp a moment, to grasp a present, and what comes from that, if not this sense that we're always changing. And that, Deleuze comes in at the end from that kind of discussion, and it's kind of the intention was to try and flip this moralizing that there's an epidemic of narcissism on its head, and actually it's what we're struck by is how uncertain we are about who we are, and that makes the selfie interesting and new, I think.
Yeah, and I think the paradox is, it seems to me, that at least whenever I take a selfie, and I'm not special in any way, it's always in the context of an audience that I would like to share it with. So, which is it's a very social move, really. It's like I'm not taking it to watch myself or to reflect upon myself later on. I rarely watch I hate seeing myself at all. Right, it's basically sharing with other folks, whether it's bragging or whether it's a funny situation, and I rarely take a selfie. And then do you talk about like a group selfie, right? Which is also an interesting phenomenon, right? So one person is taking a picture of the whole group, and it feels to me it's always in the context of sharing it with an audience. Which probably is the same thing with the portrait. When somebody paints a portrait, they have a sense of, I want an audience to see it, right? So it's, in a way, it's like if we want to use Deleuze's vocabulary, it's it's a jumping point, it's a line of flight, right? Take it here, and then it's going to create some reactions from an audience. So it's narcissistic, but at the same time, it's like, look at me. Right, look at me, but I want to engage an audience to react to what I just said. And when I see somebody's selfie, I don't think that they are not. They're sharing, right? It's I'm glad that you took that sort of phenomenon. It's a really interesting phenomenon that emerged. I don't. Do you delve into the history? Like, when was the first selfie? When did it emerge? In its current form, was it in 2010s? Because it didn't come out of the box, even though it was there, right? And what triggered it?
There was that's in the introduction to the book. I kind of trace how sort of contentious the idea of the first selfie is, because there was it was a tweet sent by Paris Hilton, of all people, who she posts a photograph of herself with Britney Spears and says, I think this was fairly more recent, but it was like a sort of commemorative thing. She says, 11 years ago, me and Brittany invented the selfie. And then there's all of this debate that kind of makes itself into the mainstream media. There was an article in the New York Times kind of questioning and wanting to see if there's any merit to that declaration. And it's interesting. I think it's a professor called Mark Marino, who's at one of the Californian universities, and he says, well, yes, in some ways, the first photographic selfie that we are aware of was taken in 1837 by an American photographer. It's the first kind of, someone's putting a camera to themselves in isolation. It's one of the very first photographs of a then living person. But he sort of then adds, Paris Hilton isn't wrong in saying that. Yep. She might be recognizing she's doing something new, which I think is also true. And I kind of trace that context, which is what you have. And I think this is true also for what you were saying about how we approach the selfie ourselves, whether it's group selfies or otherwise, of wanting to share our lives. You have Paris Hilton, Britney Spears in the mid 2000s, two of the most photographed celebrities for sure, but probably in general, two of the most photographed people alive at that moment, constantly hounded by the paparazzi. Britney Spears very famously, who then has this very public mental breakdown as a result of that hounding. And so the argument that I put in the book for this is that, what makes that selfie of theirs so interesting is that despite being photographed so incessantly by this kind of broader surveillance culture, it's a photograph of two very famous women wanting to, providing a more private view into their own lives. It's rather than sort of being inundated with photographs taken of them by others. It's kind of the first time they say, well, okay, here's a photograph that we've taken of ourselves. This is how we see ourselves.
I see. Yeah.
And that's fascinating, not just for all of us, but especially for how that changes, I think, our understanding of celebrity. And now we kind of do live in this era where the most famous people aren't there's this new culture of relatability.
It's true.
Where even the most famous people are striving to make themselves relatable to the general public. And that's new. That's, we didn't have that 20 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the reason why I'm struck by that sort of like that tension between there is some narcissism in the act, but at the same time, it is a social thing is because, I don't know, you're probably a millennial, maybe a digital generation. You're probably in your 20s, right? So you belong to that crowd of folks who grew up, with all this technology, or at least,
I'm 32, so I just remember a time before the internet, but only just.
Barely,
definitely my teenagers. I remember the birth of social media.
Yeah, you do remember, but you lived all your life basically completely comfortable with it, and right?
Yeah.
So the reason I sort of I bring up that tension is because this generation, the folks who are protesting, the guys, all the encampments, all these students, right? In fact, before all this started, I don't know, maybe just a year or two ago, the older folks, or maybe everybody, sort of declared them to be just useless, right? Brainless. They have no social conscience. They're just completely immersed into their, social platforms, their TikToks and all that. They just scroll endlessly, and so we just and it turns out that in fact they are the complete opposite, and now we, the folks who have been condemning them, have been put to shame for our timidity, for our disconnectedness from the real world, for our reliance on a narrative. We cling to that narrative, at least, the vast majority of the mainstream, mainly both liberals, whatever. We have this narrative of the United States is this great nation. Oh yeah, of course, you have faults here and there. And these folks that were denounced as being completely empty-headed turned out to be the folks who, number one, reacted the right way to a massacre, to a genocide, viscerally, right? Number two, not just a demonstration for 2 or 3 weeks, but a sustained, right, which shows a certain level of long-term commitment to something. They are not just fleeting, right? It's not just you just erupt and then go, right? Which is sort of the ethos of the short clip, right? You see it, you get excited, you move on to the next one. They're not moving on. which is completely surprising and heartening, to be honest with you, at least from my stand. And so that sort of that paradox is interesting, and you can never really understand human beings, right? That's why you have to engage in this dialectic with them. So, but number one is, I don't know about you, but I have been extremely disappointed by the reaction of the intellectual in all of this. Very, very disappointed. I mean, let alone academia. Academia has been a disaster in terms of professors, right? The vast majority of professors have been extremely timid. They have not come forth. They are clearly there's a moral stand to be taken here, and there's no courage, right? And I give the anecdote of where there was this professor from University of Pennsylvania. Her name is Claire Finkelstein. She published an op-ed in December, asking for clamping down on speech on campus, straight up, right? And it was a hysterical piece. It was not cogent. It didn't make an argument, right? And so at the time, I was associated with Social Epistemology, the journal, right? I was one of the at-large editors, and so I basically took it upon myself to reach out to about 70 plus academics, right, to get their reaction to her piece. Just tell me what you think about her piece, Out of that, and I got like 4 reactions or 2 or something. These are people that I had a relationship with, that I would email and they email them, but nothing, right? 2 of them came back. And then those 2, they promised to write, and they brought, and we ended up with 10. But the story is that it took a lot of struggle to get 10 reactions to an op-ed about the speech. Limiting is not what do you think about the conflict in Gaza? What do you think about this clampdown on speech on campus by universities where there's supposed to be freedom of speech? This is where you dish out controversial ideas. It's a lab for engaging and speaking freely and so on. Obviously, there's a whole context here, a political context of, DEI and all that stuff. Anyway, but the point really is, I'm very disappointed, not only by those, but also by intellectuals, to the point where I was so disgusted by, for example, the journal where I was at, right? So they published those 10 pieces. And I was like, this is a genocide that's happening. I don't see anything. You're still navel gazing. You're talking about stuff that doesn't, but this is the issue of our time. And they just pushed back, and I said, okay, I can't have a relationship with a journal like this. And I'm just, disgusted by you guys, and I moved on. And so, and these are people that I respected for the longest time, right? They didn't speak up. They were afraid. People who have tenure are afraid. So what is that tenure for? Right? And I know where they stand. It's not like they are, it's clear, right? Anyway, what do you feel about the reaction of the intellectual here? It doesn't seem like it's like 1968 where you had all these intellectuals, you had Marcuse and you had Foucault and you had all those people who were, part of the movement, and they provided concepts and they helped explain. But I don't see any of that here, number one. And number two, does a revolution need an ideology? Or in this case, it was purely a reaction to something very visceral, seeing children being decapitated day in and day out, and seeing the states, and we'll talk about the war machine and the state and so forth, right? The state just asserting a narrative that just doesn't hold given the data and the phenomena. It just doesn't hold. It cannot be that the United States it cares about the civilians and yet sends plane loads of 2,000-pound bombs. And so the disconnect there was is huge. And so therefore, I don't think these folks, these kids, let's call them, are deeply steeped into political theory. I don't think they are deeply steeped in anything as such. I don't even know. I don't think they understand the conflict. At least at the beginning, they understand the history of the conflict, right? I think they came in and it was just that this is disgusting, right? What's happening. And so they reacted viscerally. I think since then, I think they have definitely evolved in terms of their understanding, a lot of conversations, community. Anyway, so I'm coming from there. I want to hear your reaction about all of that in terms of the intellectual world, and then the follow-up question to you is, Well, then what's the use of the intellectual? What's the use of academia? What's the use of an education in the humanities when, you know, you end up just being quiet and taking care of your own little career?
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand it either. It's been really disappointing that even with friends that not even friends, just people sort of an ambient awareness of, I
Yeah.
guess, whatever can constitute like an intellectual scene, especially at least in the UK, what's local to me at least. The people that are, you see around, even if they generally agree with, and are supportive of the Palestinian cause, there is a real reticence to speak up. And I think that's partly one conversation that I've had repeatedly is that I think what it's highlighted for me is how there's a real lack of independence, at least in how we're able to think, or who can speak, who can write, who can publish their own thoughts on these things. Whereas even if someone very much agrees with supports the Palestinian cause, they will maybe write something and then be shut down by an editor or some higher up in an organization that runs some kind of journal or publisher or whatever else.
Yeah.
And a conversation that I've heard a few times over the past few months is, that I think it really it demonstrates that we really lack in an intellectual culture a kind of a sense of independence, where the people that are hosting platforms for various kinds of writing have their own vested interests that aren't the same as the people that they pay to write for them. I think that's very much true. That's even true here in Newcastle. There's been an encampment here on the university campus for maybe going on 2 months now. And those students have kind of been through hell. They've been, I remember I was there maybe a week or so after they first set up camp. I mean, I'm also a student, but I've had too many other responsibilities to be able to camp out with them, as much as it would be, a great act of solidarity. But they were sort of telling stories of kind of not really being engaged with by the institution, and then in the middle of the night, they would have sort of local unknown persons approaching the tents, playing loud music, disrupting their sleep, really trying to just, sort of push them to stop what they're doing. But their focus at the moment has been very much on getting the university to divest from weapons manufacturing.
Yeah.
The university itself will say, we're not actually invested in any of these things, blah, 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 blah. The numbers suggest otherwise. But I think it's kind of like there's this focus on getting the university to divest materially from these apparatuses that are kind of, embroiled in academia at the moment. But even if they say no and that there's not that kind of investment, why is there still this hostility to the movement? You might not have literal investments in these things, so you say, but there's clearly a vested interest in something else there. And what's that about? And I think, you're right that it's something that has sort of been to at least focus on Deleuze. I mean, he was one of many writing in the. And notably in the late 60s, I think that's what's so interesting is that for all of Deleuze's writings on Palestine and the Palestinian cause, the context is super important because you have, May 68 in France, where you have this alliance between students and factory workers that organize a general strike, bring the French economy to its knees. But then, 1967, you have Six-Day War, and then you have this war of attrition that continues up to 1970. This struggle at home, so completely dovetailed with this struggle elsewhere, and they were seen as a part of the same thing. And what's so strange at the moment in kind of thinking back to that time, which is so different from our present, but you have at least, I can only kind of speak to the UK context, but I guess it's something that's true in lots of different places. Since the financial crash in 2008, there has been this kind of struggle to develop some kind of, broadly leftist struggle.
Yeah.
And then you have the situation now in Gaza, which, kind of does echo that moment in the late 60s. You have this fervor of of political resistance at home on the left, and a situation elsewhere that very much, shows just how disastrous a kind of global capitalist imperialist project has been and continues to be for one specific people.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a great difficulty because of the nature of the moment that we live in, where of kind of really joining those things together. And I don't think that's the responsibility of the left itself. It's kind of the way that all of these different forces have kind of been spread out throughout society. So even the academy now is, rather than being at the heart of those kind of intellectual debates. And I think that's kind of the other tension, really, is that we see what's happening in Gaza, and we see the pictures and the videos and everything else, and we're horrified and we reject that sort of immediately. But I guess what was also happening at the time in like the late 60s was this kind of awareness of how we think about Israel as an entity, as a geopolitical entity. And that, Israel is not just a question of geopolitics specifically, it's a problem for thought, for Western thought, especially, I think, as the kind of sort of like a frontier for a lot of, of the forces that kind of define life in the West.
Yeah.
And we've lost that connection between, it's no longer a problem for thought. Israel is not to be thought about and questioned.
I think
it's tragic.
Yeah, I think in the 60s, I think the Gaza of the 60s was Vietnam, right? It seems to me, right? So that's the face of imperialism showing its full ugliness, right? And that same imperialism, capitalism, was imposing itself on the workers, right, and labor and so forth. And right now, I think I see more or less the same kind of dynamic between this generation, which is now facing, perils like the environment, of facing a very economically unstable situation, facing the situation where wealth is in the 0.1%, right? This huge disconnect. So I think what's boiling inside of them, this generation, which is really anxious, I think, is this uncertainty and how they have been screwed inside out by, by I don't know, by the boomers and the X, right, who've messed up the wealth distribution. They didn't take care of ensuring that there is a middle class. The middle class is disappearing. The prospects of the young generations are dim, and then you have this. Just basically this crystallization of the problem on who is guilty is this system, the system that is hypocritical, that is violent, that is completely, self. It's a machine. It's in a way. So we're going to start. I think this is where I think the vocabulary and the concepts of Deleuze are going to start to help us. Is there is a state, right? A state, and now I think universities are part of that state, right? They are businesses more than anything else, right? They're businesses, and therefore they are going to follow this narrative, this top-down narrative, this arboreal narrative, right? The truth, and then beyond that, everything else is, or what needs to find it is this war machine, right? So let's start with the concept of the war machine, which usually is, I think, interpreted, at least the way I read Deleuze, is, the war machine is what opposes the state, right? The state is coming in with its tools, and the war machine is trying to engage the state in creative ways, right? And I see this happening with the encampments. The encampment was an idea. It came from protests that were shut down, and the reaction to that is we are here to stay, right? Which was, I don't know, I don't think it was completely new, but it was definitely something that was creative, right? And it just took off, right? It was took off, right? And now it makes a statement, and then it also brings in territorialization, right? They said, okay, this is our territory. We're gonna call it encampment. This is how it looks like. This is what it's all about, right? And the university is saying this is our ground, right? So there is this contention between the state and in its many forms, and I think university is a representative of the state, right? They just buy into completely with that narrative. You don't know, we know, like Hillary Clinton, these people are not informed, and her indignation towards them as people who don't know what they're doing, which is echoes of Plato, right? Plato, the class that knows should rule, and the rabble should not be ruling, right? Because they don't know what is good and what is not to the good of the society. Anyway, so maybe we can start with that, right? Maybe we can brainstorm on how we can use the concept of the war machine and this territorialization of physical territorialization, but also in terms of speech, right? It's the territory of speech. What is within bound? What is outbound? What are your thoughts?
I think there's two things for a lot of Deleuze and Guattari's thought on this, which is it's quite easy to maybe see and want to see sort of positive conceptions of these concepts that are kind of in opposition. But each of these concepts, and it's kind of what I think what makes these concepts some of the most famous ones is that they're very ambiguous.
They are.
And this is kind of why they're useful, though. It's never in their thought as that this kind of as much as they make their own political positions very clear, it's never kind of in this moral battle of like good versus evil. The problem for now, and the problem that many movements face, is that our enemies use the same tactics as we do, and the war machine is kind of a good example of that, because when they say it's in opposition to the state, I think that kind of, we need to be sure of what we mean by the state, and I guess what that means is maybe like civil society, and I guess that's something that we get when we talk about militarily. Militaries of all countries will distinguish between themselves and the civilian population.
Well, let's call it the establishment, or the network of interests that wants to maintain the status quo. But go ahead, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. But I guess the war machine then is kind of it's this thing that breaks off, essentially. So like a state has its own vested interests, but then how does a state generally go about protecting and developing those interests? It's usually through things like law, making, or even, financially, things like this. A military is kind of slightly different. And it bends the rules. It kind of moves outside of the state, specifically as a kind of as a within its borders, quite literally. You have a standing army. Militaries, we often think about them, go elsewhere. And I guess, but what's so interesting about Guattari's thoughts then is that that position isn't specific to the military. It's something that you can just as easily apply to dissidents, to revolutionaries that remove themselves from the state in another way, and kind of necessarily, maybe even develop some of the similar tactics. The same is true of territory, where and this is kind of a problem with their work in general, is that so many of these concepts are kind of poorly named. There are better names maybe we could have for them. Sure. But the way that I often think of territory, and this is kind of my own interest for my PhD, looking at the family, what Deleuze and Guattari mean by territory is a sense of home, a sense of natural belonging in a if not turning space into a place. That's territorialization. And I guess university campuses can be thought of as a very interesting kind of territory, because they're home to many things. For many students, a campus is literally their home. If you're an undergraduate student, you go and you live there for 3 years. That is where you call home. It's also home to many other things. I guess in this instance, as well, especially in the present, it's the home of a certain kind of business.
Yeah.
And so these territories are very blurry. They have, there's a process involved there that is disrupting this sense of a territory, of a home. And so, these processes of, when Deleuze and Guattari then talk these other two concepts that are very related to this, deterritorialization and reterritorialization, Deterritorialization is, I guess, this a process of breaking down, of blurring the lines of a territory. And I guess the Guattari, in one of his books that he wrote on his own, has a very useful example related to the family specifically. So he talks about how we have an understanding of the aristocratic family, a house in the sense of, like, I don't know, I think of Game of Thrones or something. You have a very strict hierarchy, a line of succession. Even if you're not royalty, you have, there's the patriarch, the sons who will inherit it, and then there's a whole structure there that is neatly defined and everyone knows their role.
Yeah.
The capitalist family dissolves this entirely. You are made to have far more responsibilities than to your own house. So you need to go out and get a job and you have to work. And since capitalism wants all individuals, all subjects to take part in the labor market, it has to dissolve the sort of certainty of these social roles. So the patriarch isn't just the head of the family. He, maybe he's also having to go out and be the breadwinner. But then, now that's not necessarily true either. Or, children, teenagers, I don't know, 16, 18-year-olds, you also have to go out and work. Mum also has to go out and work. So this hierarchy of responsibilities within the home is dissolved. But then we get this process of reterritorialization. And the point of that is that even though the sort of hierarchy of the family has been ideologically dissolved, what has been lost is then filled in with an overcoding, so that we place even more emphasis on what Deleuze and Guattari called the Oedipal triangle, this relationship of mother, father, child. Even though those relationships have lost their footing compared to where they were historically, we lean into those ideas all the more to kind of convince ourselves that what is lost is still there. Anyway, to return to the university, I think we can see it in a similar way. You have this, we can kind of tell, as we've sort of already been talking about, we've lost this understanding of what the academy is. It's not this kind of state of exception where anyone can think and live and, engage in a life of thought.
Yeah.
That's been dissolved entirely. And now it's a kind of business of, lecturers are service providers, students are customers. But all the more reason then that we still have this idea of what the academy is, and we kind of lean into it, and it's overcoded. Students are clients, but we have this ideal still that we hold on to of going into education. And that idea then conflicts with the reality.
Yeah. Which is, that's what makes these protests interesting, is that they want to reinstate the, I don't know if it was ever the case that the university is the place where you can freely express yourself. But there's this ideal conception of, we should be able to speak our mind. What you're doing is wrong. And so there is, I think, a clinging, like you were saying, trying to go back to something that is structured, or that we believe in. And so the students are sort of leaning on that, the concept of a place where you can freely express yourself. And I think what's interesting also is that the context is always important. The historical context is, before this, there is this massive clamping down on people who are expressing opinions that marginalized communities that were being promoted, I don't know, LGBTQ and so forth, right? If you say something that is deemed to be not completely in compliance with that, there was a clampdown, right? They shout them down, they boycott them, right? Let's say you don't believe in, you don't believe in women or men who became women, I may speak in old-fashioned terms, and are competing in sports, right? You could have somebody make an argument. They would be shouted down, right? So it's interesting how that is followed now by students who insist on freedom of speech. And I wonder if that insistence now is going to expand to, or is going to be true to its calling? Are they going to allow folks who come in with heterodox, somebody who says, yeah, I like Hitler or something outrageous? Is it going to be really open so that anybody can say whatever they want, and everybody's an adult, and everybody will make their minds, and we don't have Plato's, philosopher king who will tell us it's not good for you to hear these things, right? And so I'm really anxious to see what are the dividends of this. Is it going to be simply, maybe there is some progress in terms of these universities not engaging in financing genocide and so forth, and that's the end of that? Or are we going to see something far more interesting, which is truly a broadening or a return, if there was ever a place to return to, or the emergence of the campus as being a place where you can, in fact, express yourself freely, or even worse, it's going to be where, no, you cannot. There are certain things you can't talk about. I mean, I'm anxious to see what's going to happen in a year. What direction are we going to go to? And then
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.